Genesis chapter 4 is one of the most well-known stories in the Bible, yet also one of the most troubling. It's the story of Cain and Abel, two brothers who supposedly mark the beginning of human life outside the Garden of Eden. But when you look closely, this short chapter is filled with contradictions, moral problems, and unanswered questions that say a lot more about ancient storytelling than about divine truth. The chapter begins with Adam and Eve having children. Cain is born first, then Abel. Cain becomes a farmer, Abel a shepherd. Nothing unusual there. But the very next part is strange. Both brothers make offerings to God, but only Abel's gift is accepted. Abel brings animal sacrifice, Cain brings crops, and for some reason God looks with favor on Abel's offering, but rejects Cain's. No explanation is given. No reasoning is offered. It's not even clear what was wrong with Cain's gift. This silence is important because it sets the stage for everything that happens. If God is supposed to be fair, just, and loving, why would he play favorites between the two? Why accept one sacrifice and not the other? The text doesn't say Cain gave rotten produce or that Abel was more sincere. It simply says God chose one and ignored the other. That's not a moral lesson. It's arbitrary. And arbitrariness is dangerous, especially when it comes from a supposed perfect being. What it really shows is that the story reflects human bias toward blood sacrifice, the belief that killing animals was more valuable to the gods than farming. In fact, across many cultures of the ancient world, slaughtering animals was considered the highest form of offering because blood was thought to have mystical power. Genesis 4 is simply repeating that cultural superstition, not revealing eternal wisdom. Cain reacts with anger and jealousy, which is exactly how most people would react if a parent or authority figure treated siblings unfairly. But instead of admitting that favoritism causes conflict, the story shifts the blame to Cain's character. God tells him he must master his sin, as if the injustice of the situation doesn't matter. This frames the problem not as God's arbitrary behavior, but Cain's inability to control his emotions. Yet the real issue is still there. What kind of God creates unnecessary rivalry between two brothers and then punishes one for reacting in a human way? Cain kills Abel, and this becomes the first murder in the Bible. The mark of Cain enters the story, a mysterious sign placed on Cain after the killing. But notice how strange the logic is. Cain fears that others will kill him in revenge, so God places a protective mark on him. Wait, others? Who exactly are these others? The Bible has only mentioned Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel so far. Where did these other people come from? If Cain is afraid of them, then Genesis quietly assumes a whole population exists outside the family of Adam and Eve, which undermines the idea that these are the first humans. It suggests the authors weren't even trying to be consistent, but were simply telling folklore where details didn't have to add up. The story also raises another problem. Cain kills a man, and God doesn't kill Cain in return. Instead, he sends him away, protects him from harm, and lets him build a city. That means Cain, the first murderer, gets more mercy than Adam and Eve, who were cast out of Eden for merely eating fruit. The punishment doesn't fit the crime. And if God's law is supposed to be absolute, why would he be so inconsistent? The text doesn't explain. It simply moves on. Cain goes to live in the land of Nod, east of Eden. He takes a wife, who again must have come from somewhere else. And then he builds a city. A city, how? With just his wife and maybe a few children. You can't have a city without a population. This makes no sense unless the writers assumed a whole world of people outside of Adam's family, which again means Adam and Eve are not the first humans, and the story collapses under its own contradictions. But what's even more revealing is the deeper psychology of this story. It reflects the ancient anxiety about farming versus herding, two very different lifestyles in early human society. Nomadic shepherds often clashed with settled farmers, and this myth could be seen as encoding that rivalry. Abel, the shepherd, is favored, while Cain, the farmer, is cursed. That might reflect the worldview of a herding culture that wanted to elevate its own lifestyle as divinely chosen. So the story isn't about universal morality at all. It's about one culture justifying itself against another. Later in the chapter, Cain's descendants are listed. They become the founders of civilization, builders of cities, inventors of music, makers of tools. In other words, everything humans accomplish supposedly comes from the line of a murderer. That's not a flattering picture. It suggests human progress itself is rooted in violence, exile, and rebellion, which is a strikingly cynical view of humanity. Even more disturbing is how the story introduces Lamech, a descendant of Cain. Lamech brags to his wives that he killed a man and will be avenged 77 times. This is basically a song celebrating violence and revenge, and it's presented without condemnation, and which shows again how the text normalizes brutality instead of questioning it. If this story were truly meant to teach moral lessons, what exactly would those lessons be? That God unfairly favors some people over others, that blood sacrifice is more important than honest effort, that murderers can be protected while ordinary disobedience is punished harshly, that humanity's achievements are born out of violence. These are not uplifting truths. They're reflections of how ancient people explained their world with fear, rivalry, and bloodshed. And yet, countless generations have been told this story as if it reveals divine wisdom. In reality, it reveals how easily human beings projected their own struggles into myth. The favoritism of parents, the rivalry of brothers, the clash between herders and farmers, the normalization of violence. All of it shows us human psychology, not divine justice. When people say the Bible is the foundation of morality, Genesis 4 should make them pause, because here we see a God who causes conflict, rewards bloodshed, and protects a murderer while condemning minor mistakes more harshly. That's not a guide to morality. It's a reflection of tribal values and human flaws. And this is only one short chapter, just a handful of verses. Yet already the cracks are showing. Already the story raises more questions than it answers. If a text this early in the Bible is filled with contradictions, arbitrary judgments, and broken logic, what does that say about the rest of it? The story of Cain and Abel is powerful. But not because it reveals divine wisdom. It's powerful because it shows us the very human tendency to tell stories that justify our fears, our rivalries, and our violence. And once you see it that way, the whole story changes. Cain's punishment and protection introduce one of the most unsettling themes in the Bible: selective justice. If God really wanted to stop violence, why protect Cain after a murder? Why not intervene before Abel was killed? This problem isn't just about one story. It echoes through the whole Bible. A God who can stop tragedy but chooses not to, then offers partial mercy at random. This isn't divine justice, it's favoritism, written into the very foundation of the text. And Cain's so-called mark is another example of how vague this writing is. The Bible never explains what the mark is. Was it a scar, a tattoo, a change in skin color, or something symbolic? Over the centuries, people filled in the blanks with dangerous ideas. In some periods of history, religious leaders even claimed the mark was dark skin, using Genesis 4 to justify racism and slavery. A vague line in an ancient story ended up fueling oppression for centuries. That shows how texts with unclear meanings can be twisted into tools of power, and why they should never be taken as unquestionable authority. The genealogy of Cain's descendants, too, raises more questions than it answers. Cain builds a city and names it after his son, Enoch. But if humanity is only a handful of people, how is there enough population for a city? And why is Cain, a murderer, allowed to become the founder of civilization? There's a disturbing undertone here. It implies human progress is born out of violence and defiance, as if the story wants us to believe that greatness comes not from peace, but from blood and rebellion. Then comes the figure of Lamech. He introduces polygamy, taking 2 wives, and then boasts about killing a man. He even claims his vengeance will be 77 times greater than Cain's. If Cain's story already showed moral chaos, Lamech takes it to another level. He turns murder into poetry, and the text doesn't condemn him, it simply records his boast. which tells us the writers of the story weren't concerned with building consistent morality. They were documenting the brutal values of their time and passing them down as if they had divine weight. This is one of the strangest aspects of Genesis. The Bible is often treated as if it provides timeless moral guidance. But when you read Genesis 4 closely, you don't get timeless guidance. You get a snapshot of ancient tribal thinking, rivalry between farming and herding, celebration of vengeance, and acceptance of polygamy and bloodshed. These aren't divine truths, they're human struggles preserved in myth. Toward the end of the chapter, the focus shifts back to Adam and Eve. They have another son, Seth, and Seth is presented as a replacement for Abel, but notice the coldness of that framing. Abel's death isn't mourned, it's simply corrected by producing another child. It reduces human life to a slot that can be filled. Abel isn't valued for his individuality, only for his role in continuing the chosen line. That says a lot about the worldview behind this text. People are not individuals with inherent worth. They're pawns in a bigger story, and that mentality has echoed through religious traditions where individuals are often seen as expendable compared to God's plan. And the final line of the chapter says, "At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord," which is a fascinating detail because it suggests that before this point, people weren't worshiping God at all. Not Adam and Eve, not Cain, not Abel. Worship of God only begins after generations have passed. That undermines the idea of an eternal relationship between God and humanity. It suggests that belief and worship were cultural inventions beginning at a specific moment, not universal truths from the start. So what does Genesis 4 really give us? A God who plays favorites, a brother who kills out of jealousy, a punishment that doesn't fit the crime, a world that suddenly has more people than it should, a murderer who builds a city, descendants who boast about violence, and a replacement child to keep the story going. What's missing? Clear moral guidance, coherence, justice. If this chapter is supposed to show us the origin of morality, it fails spectacularly. But if it shows us the origin of myth, it makes perfect sense. Myths don't have to be consistent. They just have to reflect the concerns of the people who tell them. And here we see those concerns: rivalry, blood sacrifice, vengeance, and survival. And maybe that's the most important point. When people treat Genesis as literal history or as perfect moral law, they miss what it really is. A flawed human story shaped by fear and power struggles, not a guide to truth, but a mirror of human weakness. What makes Genesis 4 so revealing is not just what it says, but what it leaves out. For example, there's no attempt to explain how Cain's wife existed or how a city could be founded with so few people. That silence tells us something important. The authors weren't writing history, they were weaving folklore. And folklore doesn't care about strict logic. It cares about symbolism. Cain's wife is simply a placeholder to keep the story moving, not a real person meant to fit into a timeline. But when stories like this are treated as literal truth, those gaps become huge problems. Whole traditions have invented elaborate explanations to fill them. Some claim Adam and Eve had dozens of unnamed children who married one another. Others say God created other people outside Eden. But notice what's happening here. Religious communities are forced to invent answers to keep the story alive. Instead of the text giving clarity, it leaves confusion and people scramble to patch the holes. That's not divine revelation, that's human improvisation. And it gets even more troubling when you consider what the story says about morality. Cain murders his brother, and his punishment is exile. But Adam and Eve eat fruit and they're condemned forever. If God is consistent, how does eating fruit deserve harsher punishment than taking a human life? Some defenders argue that Cain shows repentance and Adam and Eve did not. But the text doesn't say that. It never says Cain apologized or showed remorse. In fact, Cain complains about his punishment, not about his crime, which makes his treatment even stranger. This inconsistency has ripple effects. If God's justice is unpredictable, then morality in the system isn't based on reason or fairness. It's based on whatever God decides in the moment. That kind of morality can justify anything, and historically, it often has. People have defended slavery, holy wars, and even genocide by appealing to God's will instead of consistent ethical reasoning. Genesis 4 is one of the earliest examples of how shaky that foundation really is. Another overlooked element of the story is the obsession with blood sacrifice. Abel's offering is accepted because it involves death. Cain's offering is rejected because it involves plants. This theme repeats again and again throughout the Bible, from animal sacrifices in the temple to the idea that sin requires blood, all the way to the crucifixion in the New Testament. Genesis 4 plants the seed of this belief that killing is somehow more pleasing to God than peaceful offerings. And when you step back, that's disturbing. Why would a supposedly loving deity value spilled blood over honest labor? The only answer is cultural. In ancient times, blood was seen as life force, powerful and mysterious. Sacrificing it was considered the ultimate gift. Genesis isn't teaching morality, it's preserving that superstition. Then there's the psychology of Cain. He represents resentment, envy, and violence. But again, notice how the story frames it. Cain's anger isn't just about his own feelings, it's triggered by God's favoritism. The text puts all the responsibility on Cain, but never asks why God set up such an unfair test in the first place. It's like blaming a child for being jealous when a parent praises one sibling and ignores the other. The real root of the problem is the authority figure's partiality. Yet in Genesis, God is never questioned. Instead, the human character is condemned. This sets a pattern that appears throughout Scripture. The deity is beyond critique, and humans must take all the blame. Even when the system itself is unfair, that pattern has deep consequences. When people internalize it, they learn not to question authority, even when authority is unjust. They learn to see themselves as the problem, not the system. And that mentality has been used by institutions for centuries. Leaders claim divine authority, their decisions are beyond question, and ordinary people carry the guilt. Genesis 4 is a seed of that psychology. The mark of Cain adds another layer. Not only does Cain escape death, he's given protection. Anyone who harms him will suffer vengeance 7 times over. This flips morality on its head. Instead of defending the victim, Abel, God defends the murderer and even expands his protection, making Cain's safety a priority. What message does that send? That power matters more than justice, that even a killer can be shielded if God wills it. Again, it mirrors human society, where powerful figures often escape accountability while victims are forgotten. And when Cain's line goes on to invent tools, music, and cities, the irony deepens. Civilization itself is portrayed as descending from a murderer's bloodline. It's as if the Bible is saying that human culture is built on violence from the start. Maybe that's unintentionally honest. Human history has indeed been shaped by conquest and bloodshed. But it's striking that the text doesn't challenge that reality. It accepts it. It presents civilization as emerging from violence, not in spite of it. That brings us to Lamech's boast. This part of the story is like a mirror held up to human arrogance. Lamech doesn't just kill, he brags about it. He multiplies Cain's cycle of violence. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. It's an escalation of brutality. And the fact that it's preserved in Scripture without critique is telling. It shows the text normalizing violent pride, not condemning it. So, in just one chapter, what picture of humanity do we get? Brothers turning on each other, blood valued over crops, arbitrary punishment, murderers protected, and violence glorified. And this is supposed to be foundational morality? If anything, it's a warning, not about sin, but about how fragile human stories are when they're mistaken for moral law. When you look at Genesis 4 sociologically, the whole story begins to read less like divine revelation and more like a snapshot of cultural conflict. Cain the farmer and Abel the shepherd weren't just brothers. They symbolized 2 competing ways of life. Farming required permanent settlements, fixed plots of land, and systems of ownership. Herding required mobility, pastures, and constant movement. These two lifestyles often clashed in the ancient world. Pastoral tribes resented farmers for fencing off land, while farmers resented herders for letting flocks wander into crops. So what does Genesis do? It casts the herder Abel as the favored one, and the farmer, Cain, as the cursed one. This isn't morality, it's propaganda. It reflects the values of a culture that wanted to elevate nomadic shepherding as the chosen lifestyle. And when you think about the later Israelites, it makes sense. Their identity was shaped around herding, wandering, and eventually settling. The story of Cain and Abel can be seen as a way of validating their roots, presenting shepherds as divinely approved and farmers as rejected. It's not about God's justice, it's about a culture defending its own way of life through myth. But here's the irony. Later in history, Israel itself became more agricultural. Farming became central. Yet the old myth stayed, and with it the idea that God somehow prefers blood and flocks to crops and soil. This tension runs through the entire Bible, and it started right here in Genesis 4. And then there's the way Genesis 4 sets up human history. Cain, the murderer, becomes the ancestor of those who create civilization. His descendants invent instruments, tools, and cities. This paints civilization itself as morally compromised from the start. It suggests progress is inseparable from violence. That's a strikingly cynical worldview for an allegedly holy book. And it resonates with something anthropologists and historians often note. Human civilizations really have been built on conquest, domination, and bloodshed. But the difference is, modern historians present that as something we should challenge. Genesis simply accepts it as the way things are. This acceptance of violence bleeds into later uses of the story. For centuries, some communities used the mark of Cain to justify social hierarchies. Interpreters claimed it meant dark skin and used it as religious cover for racism. That's not in the text itself, but it shows how easily a vague symbol can be weaponized when a story is treated as sacred. What began as an unexplained mark in an old folktale ended up being used to justify slavery, segregation, and systemic oppression. This isn't just ancient superstition, it had real, lasting harm. Even the family dynamics in Genesis 4 carry dangerous lessons when taken as moral truth. God favors Abel. Cain is consumed with jealousy and violence erupts. But instead of condemning favoritism, the text frames Cain as the problem. The message is that people should control themselves even when treated unfairly, instead of challenging the source of injustice. That's a pattern that has been repeated in countless religious teaching. Obey, endure, don't question authority, even if it's unfair. If this is the foundation of morality, it's a foundation that excuses power and blames the powerless. And then consider Abel himself. He does everything right, and he dies. That's it. He disappears from the story, replaced by Seth. Abel's life shows the futility of being righteous in this system. You can be favored by God, offer the right sacrifice, and still end up murdered without protection. No justice for Abel, no comfort for his parents, no lesson drawn from his loss. Just a replacement son. That isn't divine wisdom. It's the logic of a story that treats people as disposable. Psychologically, the story also feeds into a fear-driven worldview. Cain's fear of being killed, even though no other humans have been named yet, shows how the narrative assumes a hostile, violent world outside the garden. The Bible never addresses where those people came from. It simply assumes they exist. That tells us the storytellers were surrounded by other cultures, other tribes, and they projected those anxieties into the narrative. Cain isn't just afraid of nobody, he's afraid of the others beyond his family. It's one of the earliest biblical moments where us versus them thinking appears, and it never really goes away. And look at how quickly violence escalates. From one brother killing another to a descendant, Lamech, boasting about killing and demanding exaggerated vengeance. That escalation mirrors the cycle of violence we see in human societies everywhere. Retaliation, revenge, and the idea that harm must be answered with greater harm. By preserving that mindset as part of the origin story of humanity, Genesis 4 bakes violence into the very DNA of the tradition. Instead of challenging revenge, it amplifies it. Even the closing line about people beginning to call on the name of the Lord is revealing. Worship isn't presented as natural or automatic. It's something that starts at a specific time in a specific cultural context, which suggests religion itself that innate, it's constructed. People began worshiping not because of divine command, but because cultural need demanded it. The writers of Genesis project that beginning backward into myth, but in doing so, they unintentionally admit that worship is something that begins, evolves, and spreads socially. So when you put it all together, what do we really see? Genesis 4 is not a clear moral story about sin and consequence. It's a cultural tale reflecting ancient rivalries, the glorification of blood, and the inevitability of violence. It leaves us with contradictions, arbitrary divine choices, and human suffering brushed aside as unimportant. The real danger isn't that this story exists, it's that people still look to it as sacred, unquestionable truth. That's how vague symbols become justifications for oppression, how arbitrary favoritism becomes a model for obedience, and how violence becomes normalized instead of challenged. Genesis 4 doesn't just tell a story about two brothers, it lays the groundwork for themes that repeat across the entire Bible. One of the biggest is the obsession with blood. Abel's offering of an animal is accepted. Cain's offering of plants is rejected. That moment is the start of a pattern. The idea that spilled blood is more valuable to God than peaceful gifts. This belief runs straight through the Old Testament, where sacrifices are commanded over and over again. Sheep, goats, bulls, doves, all killed to please God. And eventually, the New Testament builds its entire theology on blood, the blood of Jesus framed as the ultimate sacrifice. It all starts here with a story where God favors one bloody offering over another peaceful one. That detail alone should make us pause, because it suggests the foundation of the faith isn't life, but death. Not nurturing crops, but spilling blood. And when you think about how many centuries of violence, crusades, inquisitions, and wars have been carried out under the banner of that theology, the consequences of this preference are impossible to ignore. Another theme set up here is vengeance. Cain fears being killed for what he did, so God gives him protection. But then Cain's descendant Lamech boasts that if Cain is avenged 7 times, he will be avenged 77 times. That escalation is the logic of revenge, and it never really disappears from Scripture. The Old Testament famously proclaims an eye for an eye, and later books describe wars of extermination against whole peoples in the name of God. Violence is not an exception in the Bible, it's baked into the foundation. Genesis 4 shows us where that begins. Then there's the idea of the chosen. Abel is chosen, Cain is rejected, Seth is chosen, Abel is replaced. This pattern repeats throughout the Bible. Isaac chosen over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Israel over other nations. The theme of favoritism isn't just a minor detail. It's the framework of the entire text. Like God doesn't love equally. God chooses some, rejects others, and lets the rejected suffer the consequences. Genesis 4 introduces this system with Cain and Abel, and it never goes away. But think about what that teaches people. If you're on the chosen side, you're safe. If you're on the rejected side, you're doomed no matter what. That kind of thinking doesn't build compassion. It builds division. It encourages people to see the world in terms of insiders and outsiders, blessed and cursed, saved and damned. And once people see themselves as chosen, violence against outsiders becomes easy to justify. You can see how this one short chapter sets a precedent that has shaped centuries of exclusion and conflict. Even the mark of Cain points in this direction as it becomes a symbol of being set apart, different, cursed, and while the text says it was meant to protect Cain, later interpretations twisted it into a mark of inferiority. That's the danger of vague, mythic writing. It leaves open doors that later generations walk through, often with devastating consequences. On a psychological level, Genesis 4 also teaches something deeply unhealthy. that when unfairness happens, you shouldn't question the authority behind it. You should just master your feelings and accept it. Cain is told to control his anger, but no one asks why God created the unfair situation to begin with. That mirrors the way religion often tells people to endure suffering, obey authority, and blame themselves rather than question the system. It's a tool for social control, wrapped in the language of morality. And look at the structure of the story. Abel dies and is never heard from again. Cain sins but goes on to prosper, building cities and leaving descendants. That imbalance sets another pattern. The innocent can die forgotten, while the guilty can still thrive, and the story doesn't challenge that. It accepts it. When texts like this are held up as sacred, they normalize injustice rather than oppose it. Even Seth's birth at the end of the chapter reinforces this cold logic. Abel isn't mourned, he's replaced. It's not about the value of a life, it's about keeping the narrative going. That's how myth works. Characters are pawns in service of the bigger story. But when people treat this as moral truth, it teaches them that individuals are expendable in the name of God's plan. And that mindset has been used to justify everything from wars to inquisitions to forcing people into roles they never chose. And that final line, people began to call on the name of the Lord, quietly admits something many overlook. Worship is not inherent, and it begins at a certain point for certain reasons. If God created humans to worship him, why did it take generations before anyone even started? The simplest answer is that religion didn't come from God, it came from people. At some moment in history, communities started inventing rituals, sacrifices, and prayers. Genesis 4 projects that invention back onto the earliest humans, but in doing so, it reveals its own human origin. When you step back and see all of this together, Genesis 4 stops being a story about two brothers and starts being a blueprint for blood sacrifice, for favoritism, for vengeance, for chosen versus rejected, for injustice framed as divine order. It's not a moral foundation, it's a warning about how human cultures encode their struggles into myth and then call it sacred. What makes Genesis 4 even more unsettling is how its themes have played out in the real world. The preference for blood sacrifice didn't stay in ancient myth. It became ritual law. Generations of people slaughtered animals on altars, believing it pleased God. Entire temple systems were built around it. And later, the theology of Christianity doubled down, claiming that the ultimate blood sacrifice was a human one. That's the ripple effect of a story that begins with Abel's lamb being chosen over Cain's crops. It set the stage for blood as currency between humanity and the divine. And the theme of vengeance didn't stay confined to Cain and Lamech. The idea that violence must be answered with greater violence has fueled holy wars, crusades, and cycles of retaliation across centuries. When Scripture frames revenge as natural, even divinely protected, it plants a seed that societies continue to water. People justify wars as God's justice because the foundation was already laid. The favoritism in Genesis 4, the idea of the chosen versus the rejected, has also had massive consequences. Communities throughout history have seen themselves as the Abel of the story, favored by God while casting others as the Cain. That mentality divides the world into insiders and outsiders, blessed and cursed. And once you believe you're on the favored side, it becomes easy to justify discrimination, conquest, or even violence against those on the outside. It's a story that seems simple on the surface, but its logic has been used to justify some of humanity's darkest behaviors. And let's not forget the mark of Cain, a symbol the text barely explains, yet one that became a justification for centuries of racism. Religious leaders and communities twisted that vague mark into a reason to enslave people, segregate them, and treat them as cursed. That's not just bad interpretation, that's the danger of giving ultimate authority to unclear, contradictory stories. When myths are treated as unquestionable truth, their ambiguity can be weaponized in ways the original storytellers never imagined. But perhaps the most troubling legacy of Genesis 4 is psychological. It teaches people to accept unfairness as part of the divine order. Cain is told to master his feelings rather than question why God set up such a biased situation in the first place. That message, endure injustice, don't challenge authority, has been repeated in religious teachings for centuries. It keeps people obedient, even when the system harms them. It shifts blame away from those in power and onto individuals, making them feel guilty for their natural responses to unfairness. That's not morality, that's conditioning. And notice how the innocent are treated in this story. Abel dies, and the narrative moves on. No justice, no comfort, no reflection. He's simply replaced by Seth. That kind of cold logic has echoes in how religious systems often treat people as expendable. Wars fought in the name of God write off thousands of lives as necessary sacrifices. Individuals are told their suffering is part of a bigger plan. Genesis 4 sets the tone for that thinking, where personal lives matter less than preserving the story. Even the idea that worship began in this chapter is telling. If humans were created to worship God, why did it take multiple generations before anyone started? The simplest answer is that worship didn't come from God. It came from people. Communities created rituals, sacrifices, and prayers to make sense of their world. Genesis 4 projects that invention back onto the earliest humans to give it divine legitimacy, but in doing so, it admits, without realizing, that religion has a human origin, not a divine one. So when we take Genesis 4 seriously, not as myth, but as supposed truth, the consequences are heavy. It sets a precedent for blood as holy, for favoritism as divine order, for vengeance as natural, for outsiders as cursed, and for individuals as disposable. And those precedents have shaped entire civilizations. But when we read Genesis 4 for what it really is, a flawed human story, it reveals something else. It shows us how people thousands of years ago tried to explain their world, why some groups thrived while others struggled, why violence kept happening, why some offerings felt more sacred than others. It's not divine wisdom, it's human storytelling. And once you see it that way, it stops being a source of unquestionable authority and becomes a historical window into ancient fears, rivalries, and attempts to make sense of life. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that God demands blood, not that some people are chosen and others cursed, not that vengeance is justified, but that when people mistake their own fears and biases for divine truth, they create systems that can last for centuries and cause real harm. Genesis 4 isn't just a story about Cain and Abel, it's a story about us, about how easily humans justify violence, excuse unfairness, and build entire civilizations on shaky foundations. And once you recognize that, you don't see the story that same way again. What makes Genesis 4 so important to examine isn't just what it says about the past, but what it reveals about the present. Because stories like this are not harmless old tales. They've shaped laws, traditions, and the way people see themselves and others for thousands of years. When you trace the logic of Cain and Abel through history, you see echoes of it in theology, in politics, and even in how societies excuse inequality. Take the idea of favoritism. In the story, God favors Abel for no clear reason. That logic shows up again and again in how religious people divide the world into the saved and the damned. It's not about justice or fairness or morality. It's about arbitrary selection. And once you internalize that worldview, it seeps into human systems too. People start justifying their own privilege or power as if it were divinely sanctioned. They see themselves as chosen and others as cursed. That's not just a theological problem, it's a social one. The obsession with blood also lives on. Religious communities still repeat phrases about being washed in the blood or redeemed by sacrifice. Those images come straight from the preference shown in Genesis 4. The symbolism of spilled blood has been so normalized that many people never stop to ask what it means. Why would death be sacred? Why would killing, rather than creating, be what pleases a supposedly perfect being? These are the kinds of questions that show just how deeply cultural superstition has been mistaken for divine command. And the theme of vengeance, you can see its influence not only in religious violence, but in modern politics and culture. The cycle of retaliation that started with Cain and spiraled through Lamech is still alive in the way nations wage war, in the way communities respond to harm, and in the way individuals are taught to equate strength with domination. Genesis doesn't challenge that mindset, it encodes it. And when people treat the text as sacred, they end up reinforcing the very cycles of violence that harm them. Even the silence around Abel's death says a lot. He's killed, and the story barely looks back. That absence of justice reflects something many people still wrestle with today. Innocence isn't always rewarded. Violence isn't always punished. And when you explain that away by saying it's God's plan, you remove the urgency to actually build justice in the real world. Genesis 4 trains people to accept unfairness instead of confronting it, and that's one of its most damaging legacies. But when you step outside of treating it as divine law, the story takes on a very different meaning. It becomes a mirror. Cain's jealousy, Abel's death, the escalation of violence through Lamech, all of it reflects patterns that humans fall into again and again: rivalry, favoritism, injustice, retaliation. These aren't divine mysteries. They're human realities, and recognizing them as human is what gives us the power to change them. Because here's the truth. If we keep treating stories like Genesis 4 as unquestionable moral guides, we'll keep repeating their mistakes, we'll keep glorifying blood over peace, favoritism over fairness, vengeance over forgiveness, and obedience over justice. But if we recognize them as ancient myths, flawed attempts to explain life with the tools of the time, we can finally move past them. We can keep the lessons about human nature while rejecting the parts that normalize violence and unfairness. And maybe that's the most valuable way to read Genesis 4 today, not as divine truth, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily humans mistake their own culture and fears for cosmic law, and how dangerous it becomes when those mistakes are treated as eternal. So in the end, Genesis 4 isn't a guide to morality. It's a window into the human mind thousands of years ago. It shows us how people justified violence, explained favoritism, and dealt with rivalry. And if we're willing to see it clearly, it also shows us how far we still have to go. Because the real story isn't about Cain or Abel, it's about us, and whether we'll keep repeating the cycles of jealousy, blood, and vengeance, or finally write something better.